The official account places a single week in October of 1962 at the center of the Cold War's most dangerous chapter. 13 days, 2 men, 2 nuclear arsenals, and a world that held its breath. The story the history books tell is a story of brinkmanship, of Kennedy and Khrushchev staring each other down across the Atlantic, of U-2 spy planes and ex-com deliberations, and a Soviet freighter holding its course until the moment it turned back from the American naval blockade. It is a story told in the language of diplomacy and courage, of rational actors finding the narrow path between annihilation and humiliation and walking it without blinking. The missiles were spotted, the ultimatum was delivered, the ships turned around, crisis averted. What survives in presidential libraries, documentary films, and classroom curricula is a narrative of leadership under pressure, of 2 men who understood the stakes and made the right choices when civilization was balanced against the clock. That story is not wrong. It is incomplete in ways the financial record makes impossible to ignore, because what the standard account omits is the institutional and economic architecture that made the crisis structurally inevitable long before a single Soviet missile ship left any Soviet port. The missiles were not the cause, they were the symptom. The cause was a decade-long sequence of corporate investment decisions, covert spending authorizations, property disputes measured in hundreds of millions of dollars, and a Cold War financial logic that treated sovereign nations as assets on a balance sheet, to be held, protected, or destroyed, depending on whose ledger they appeared in and whose capital they had displaced. If you follow the money from the October crisis backward through the years that preceded it, what appears is not a story of superpower confrontation born from ideology. What appears is a story of corporate loss, government retaliation, escalating covert investment, and a Soviet military response that was, in strategic and financial terms, the rational answer to an American commitment that had already crossed a threshold from which neither side could easily retreat. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand what the standard account leaves out, the record has to be followed backward. Not just past October of 1962, not just past the Bay of Pigs in April of 1961, but into the financial structure of Cuba as it existed under Fulgencio Batista, the dictator whose removal from power set every subsequent event in motion, and whose relationship with American capital was the invisible foundation on which the entire crisis was eventually built. Batista had ruled Cuba in 2 distinct periods. His first period of power ran from 1933 to 1944. His second period followed a coup he executed in March of 1952, months before a scheduled election in which polling suggested he would finish third. His second period of power was built almost entirely on an alliance with American corporate and organized crime interests, whose financial stake in the island was, by the late 1950s, larger than the Cuban government's own annual operating budget. The United Fruit Company held substantial tracts of Cuban agricultural land and exercised economic influence over the rural labor market the land represented. American sugar companies controlled roughly 40% of the island's sugar production, which was the single most valuable export in the Cuban economy, and the primary source of the foreign exchange that kept the Batista government financially operational. American utility companies held concessions over the island's electricity and telephone infrastructure under terms negotiated with earlier Cuban governments and extended, on favorable terms, under Batista. The ITT Corporation, through its Cuban telephone subsidiary, held a monopoly on the island's communications network under terms that guaranteed the company profitable returns regardless of the quality of the service it actually delivered. Standard Oil and Texaco operated the refinery capacity that processed Cuba's imported petroleum. The total book value of American corporate assets in Cuba by 1958 has been estimated by economic historians at between $1 billion and $1.2 billion. In the economic scale of that era, when the entire Cuban gross domestic product was approximately $2.5 billion annually, this represented a foreign corporate ownership share of the island's productive capacity that made the American business community a structural participant in Cuban governance, not merely a passive investor in Cuban commerce. When Fidel Castro's forces entered Havana on the 1st of January 1959, what they displaced was not merely a political regime that had grown too violent and too corrupt to sustain popular support. They displaced a financial system in which American corporations were the senior creditors, the infrastructure owners, the holders of the island's productive assets, and the primary beneficiaries of Cuban labor and Cuban land. The political displacement of Batista was simultaneously, and inescapably, a financial displacement of the American capital that had underwritten his government for 7 years. The scale of what was lost in that single moment of political transition cannot be overstated when measured against the financial planning horizons of American corporations in the 1950s. These were not speculative positions. They were operating assets, generating revenue, embedded in Cuban infrastructure, and supported by a government in Batista that had every incentive to protect them. American corporations had made capital allocations based on the assumption that the Batista government's stability was underwritten by American political support, American military equipment, and American commercial relationships that gave the regime its financial legitimacy. When that assumption failed, the response from the American business community was not resignation. It was demand for action. Corporate lobbying on Cuba in the period between January of 1959 and March of 1960, the window between Castro's arrival in Havana and the CIA's authorization to work toward his removal, has never been fully documented in the public record. The relevant State Department and National Security Council archives for this period remain partially classified or were removed from the accessible record during document reviews in the 1970s and 80s. What the available diplomatic and corporate correspondence from this period does establish is that American companies with Cuban assets maintained sustained contact with the State Department, provided detailed accounting of their expropriation losses, and pressed for government action that would either compel the Cuban government to provide adequate compensation or remove the government that had done the expropriating. The decision to authorize the CIA was made in an environment in which the corporate demand for action was sustained, specific, and backed by financial documentation that translated abstract political grievance into precise dollar amounts. The billion-dollar figure was not an approximation, it was an accounting, and it was placed before the policymakers who made the authorization decision. The new Cuban government moved within months to nationalize the industries that American capital had built and controlled. The process was not chaotic. It followed a deliberate sequence that the Castro government appears to have planned with attention to the political justifications each step would require. In August of 1960, the Cuban government seized the properties of American oil companies after those companies refused, on direction from the State Department and the Eisenhower White House, to refine Soviet crude oil that Cuba had begun importing from the USSR as a substitute for American supply. The refusal was a calculated provocation. Washington wanted the Cuban government to make a move that would provide legal and political justification for American countermeasures, and the oil companies were the instrument of that calculation. Cuba responded by nationalizing the refineries. By October of 1960, the nationalizations had expanded to cover banks, sugar mills, and the remaining large industrial enterprises still under American ownership. The total value of expropriated American assets was placed by the American government at approximately $1 billion. The Cuban government offered compensation in the form of bonds to be repaid from future sugar export revenue. American corporations and the American government rejected those terms as commercially inadequate and legally deficient. Financial wound was direct, it was enormous, and it created a constituency for retaliatory action inside the American government that was corporate in its origin even when it expressed itself in the language of Cold War strategy and hemispheric security doctrine. What the standard account of the Cuban Missile Crisis rarely places in this frame is that the United States government's decision to pursue covert action against the Castro government was not primarily a response to Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere. That framing came later, as the political justification evolved to meet the requirements of international law and domestic public credibility. The initial response was a property response. The Eisenhower administration's decision to authorize the CIA to recruit, train, and arm Cuban exiles for an eventual invasion of the island was taken in March of 1960. At that point, the Cuban government's relationship with the Soviet Union was commercially exploratory rather than strategically consolidated. Cuba had sent a trade delegation to Moscow in October of 1959. The formal Soviet-Cuban trade agreement, under which the USSR agreed to purchase Cuban sugar and provide oil and credit in return, was signed in February of 1960. The first Soviet crude oil arrived in Cuba that summer. The CIA's authorization to work toward the overthrow of the Cuban government preceded significant Soviet military involvement in Cuba by many months. The decision to destabilize Castro was made when the primary grievance on record was not Soviet expansion into the Western Hemisphere, but the expropriation of American corporate property. The financial logic preceded the geopolitical logic. This sequencing matters enormously because it reframes the entire trajectory of events that led to October of 1962. The Soviet decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba was not an act of first aggression by an expansionist power probing for weakness in the Western Hemisphere. It was a calculated response to a sustained and funded campaign of American covert warfare against a government that the Soviet Union had decided, for its own strategic and economic reasons, to support. By the time the missiles were shipped, Cuba had already survived one American-backed invasion attempt. A second was being actively planned and funded under a program with a 9-figure annual budget. The financial architecture of American interest in Cuba created the political conditions that made Soviet military intervention in Cuba rational from Moscow's perspective. And that Soviet intervention created the specific conditions for the missile crisis itself. The mechanism was not primarily ideological. American capital had been displaced. American covert operations were deployed to recover that displacement by force. Soviet capital and military capacity moved in to resist that recovery. The missiles were the final expression of that financial and strategic logic, not its origin. The standard account begins with the missiles. The financial record begins a decade earlier, in the boardrooms of American sugar companies and the Havana offices of American utility concessions, where the investment decisions were made that created every condition everything else followed from. The covert financial investment in the destabilization of Cuba between 1960 and 1962 has never been fully disclosed in the public record. The Church Committee hearings of 1975 revealed portions of the CIA's operational record against Cuba, including the assassination plotting against Castro that involved organized crime figures with their own substantial financial history on the island. Meyer Lansky's Havana casino empire, built under Batista's protection in exchange for payments that flowed into government accounts and private arrangements, represented an investment the organized crime community had made with the expectation of indefinite political protection. When Castro closed the casinos and expelled the mafia's Cuban operations in the first months of 1959, the financial losses were immediate, and the interest in reversing them was institutional and personal. The convergence of interest between American intelligence and organized crime that the Church Committee documented was, at its foundation, a convergence of financial grievance. Both parties had lost assets in Cuba they wanted back, and both parties had operational capacity the other could use. The CIA's budget for anti-Castro operations across all programs, from the Bay of Pigs preparation to Operation Mongoose and the associated programs run through the 1960s, ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. The precise figures for individual programs remain partially classified or were destroyed in the document purges that followed the Church Committee's initial requests. What the available record establishes is that the scale of the covert investment required multiple layers of financial concealment, including front organizations, third-country banking arrangements, and private financing channels that kept the full scope of the operation off the government's auditable accounts. That financial concealment was not incidental to the operation. It was the precondition for the operation's legal and political deniability. An American government openly spending hundreds of millions of dollars to overthrow the government of a neighboring state would have faced a fundamentally different international and domestic legal environment than one doing so through channels that did not appear on any public ledger. The gap in the financial record at this point is itself part of the argument. The accounting of American covert expenditure against Cuba in the 1960s has been reconstructed from partial disclosures, Church Committee testimony, Freedom of Information Act releases, and the memoirs of CIA officials who worked on the relevant programs. None of these sources provides a complete consolidated figure. The incompleteness is not accidental. Covert program budgets were designed to be unauditable by construction, distributed across multiple administrative accounts, and obscured by the kind of financial layering that made the full cost invisible to anyone who was not inside the specific compartment of the program that spent a given dollar. The American public in the period between 1960 and the Church Committee disclosures of 1975 had no mechanism for determining what was being spent in their name to overthrow the Cuban government. The Cuban public had no mechanism for determining what the American government was spending to destabilize their economy and fund the organizations that were working to remove their government. The Soviet government was watching and calculating. The populations on both sides of the Florida Strait were not in possession of the financial record that their governments were acting on. That asymmetry of information between what governments knew and what populations were told is itself a structural feature of the financial architecture the standard account was designed not to expose. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Bay of Pigs invasion of April of 1961 is remembered in the standard account as a political humiliation for the Kennedy administration, an operation inherited from Eisenhower, executed without adequate air support, abandoned at the critical moment when Kennedy declined to authorize American military intervention to rescue the brigade that was failing on the beaches. The political analysis is accurate as far as it goes, but the financial architecture of the operation tells a different story about who bore the cost, what the investment was designed to recover, and what the failure established for the Soviet and Cuban governments about the scale of American financial commitment to regime change in Havana. The Cuban exile brigade that landed at the Bay of Pigs was trained, equipped, transported, and operationally directed by the CIA. The direct cost of the invasion has been estimated at approximately $45 million for the operation itself. The larger preparatory infrastructure, including the training camps established in Guatemala and Nicaragua, the air assets assembled and modified for the operation, the logistics network built to support the landing, and the political organization of the Cuban exile community in Miami added substantially to that base figure. The Guatemalan and Nicaraguan governments that provided territory and facilities for the training program received financial and military assistance from Washington that was functionally payment for the use of their national soil. The operation failed. The brigade was broken on the beaches. Approximately 1,200 men were captured by Cuban government forces within 72 hours of landing. The Kennedy administration subsequently negotiated and paid a ransom of $53 million in food and medicine, arranged through private intermediaries including a committee of Cuban-American businessmen, to secure the release of the prisoners over the following year. The total American financial outlay associated with the Bay of Pigs, across all its components and including the prisoner ransom, reached a figure that dwarfed the standard political accounting of what the operation cost in terms of prestige and credibility. And the Soviet and Cuban governments drew from that financial commitment exactly the conclusion it warranted. The United States had been willing to spend in the range of $100 million on a single failed attempt to overthrow the Castro government. It had an active successor covert program in place, funded at approximately $50 million annually, to create conditions for further military action. The probability of another operation against Cuba was not a theoretical possibility. It was a budget commitment expressed in operational planning that Soviet intelligence was monitoring in real time. The formal Soviet offer to deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba was made to the Cuban government in May of 1962. The Soviet framing of the proposal, as reconstructed from Soviet and Cuban archives that became partially accessible after the Cold War ended, was explicitly defensive. The primary argument Khrushchev made was that a second American military operation against Cuba was highly probable and that the presence of Soviet nuclear weapons on the island would deter any American government from ordering such an operation. Operation Mongoose, the successor covert program authorized by Kennedy in November of 1961, had an annual operating budget of approximately $50 million. Its mandate covered sabotage of Cuban industrial and economic infrastructure, intelligence collection in preparation for potential future military action, and the development of conditions that would support a larger intervention. The Soviets were aware of this program through their own intelligence channels. Their decision to deploy missiles in Cuba was made with direct knowledge that the American government was running a funded covert war against the Cuban government, had already committed substantial resources to one failed invasion, and had authorized planning for further operations at a level of expenditure that the Soviet government had every reason to take seriously. The financial record, placed beside the standard geopolitical account, shows that the missile deployment was the Soviet government's military and strategic answer to an American investment in Cuban destabilization that had been running for 2 years, had already crossed the threshold of overt military action, and showed no indication of being discontinued. The missiles were expensive. Moving them to Cuba was logistically complex and operationally risky. The Soviets made that investment because the American investment in removing the Cuban government had created conditions that made the Soviet counter-investment rational from any perspective that engaged with the actual financial record of what Washington had committed and what it was still committing. The resolution of the crisis in late October of 1962 has been presented in the standard account as an American diplomatic victory. The financial and strategic accounting of the settlement reveals considerably more complexity. The formal resolution involved a Soviet commitment to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American public pledge not to invade the island, and a private agreement to remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey within several months of the settlement. The non-invasion pledge was the public element. The Turkish withdrawal was the private one, acknowledged by former American officials only years after the fact when the record of private communications between Robert Kennedy and Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin during the crisis became publicly available through the work of historians, with access to archival material that had been closed during the relevant officials' lifetimes. The Turkish missile removal represented a concrete strategic concession. The Jupiter missiles stationed in Turkey under a NATO agreement were aging systems the American military had already concluded were strategically redundant. given the development of more capable submarine-based deterrence. But their removal under Soviet pressure meant the deterrent commitment to NATO's southern flank required compensation through other means. That compensation came through expanded Polaris submarine deployments in the Mediterranean, a more capable and more expensive deterrent system that required additional American defense expenditure. The resolution of the crisis produced a military spending adjustment whose full cost was never presented to the public as part of the settlement's accounting. The Soviets also made a financial concession that is rarely examined in the standard account. The military infrastructure they had begun constructing in Cuba, including the missile launch sites, the associated support and communications facilities, and the equipment already delivered and partially installed, represented a substantial investment in Soviet defense resources that was abandoned without producing the strategic outcome it had been designed to achieve. Soviet military sources have placed the material cost of the Cuban missile deployment in the hundreds of millions of rubles. That investment was withdrawn without the formal recognition of Soviet-American strategic parity in the Western Hemisphere that Khrushchev had sought as the political justification for the operation. The political cost within the Soviet leadership was significant and contributed to the internal maneuvering that produced Khrushchev's removal from power in October of 1964, 2 years almost to the day after the crisis formally ended. Cuba itself has never been restored to the financial position it occupied in the American corporate ledger before 1959. That is the long consequence the standard account almost never traces to its conclusion. The American economic embargo of Cuba, first imposed by the Eisenhower administration in October of 1960 and extended by Kennedy in February of 1962 to cover nearly all bilateral trade, was the financial instrument that accompanied the covert military campaign and outlasted it by decades. The embargo was presented publicly as a response to Cuban nationalization of American property, and, later, as a response to Cuba's alignment with the Soviet Union. Its practical function was to make the Cuban economy as difficult to sustain as possible in order to generate internal pressure for a change in the Cuban government or compel a settlement that included compensation for expropriated American assets. The embargo has remained in place, with modifications, for more than 6 decades. It is the longest-running economic embargo in modern American history. The Cuban government has calculated its cumulative economic cost at over $130 billion in lost trade and investment across the full period of its operation. Independent economists have disputed the precision of that figure while accepting its general order of magnitude. What is not in dispute is that the embargo has continued to operate long after any of the original corporate interests it implicitly served could realistically expect to recover the assets they lost in 1960. The companies whose refineries, sugar mills, and telephone networks were nationalized have long since restructured, written off the Cuban assets, merged with other entities, or ceased to exist in anything resembling their original corporate form. The mechanism that was created to protect and eventually recover that capital continues to operate as policy 6 decades after the capital it was designed to protect ceased to exist as a recoverable asset. Mechanisms of this kind, once built into the legal and regulatory architecture of government policy, require active dismantling. Passive expiration is not how they end. They run until someone with the political authority and the political will to dismantle them chooses to do so. And in the case of the Cuban embargo, no American government has yet chosen to make that choice in full. The broader financial consequence of the crisis for the American defense establishment has never been fully calculated in a single public accounting. The Cuban Missile Crisis accelerated American investment in multiple nuclear deterrent systems simultaneously. The Polaris submarine program, already underway, received budget priority that pushed its deployment timeline forward. The Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile program was expanded in response to the strategic lessons the American military drew from the crisis about the inadequacy of existing land-based deterrents. The development and deployment of satellite reconnaissance systems that would provide the kind of early warning that U-2 flights could not guarantee was accelerated. Each of these programs represented defense expenditure in the billions of dollars over the years that followed. The financial legacy of the Cuban Missile Crisis was not limited to the settlement. It extended through the defense budget allocations of the 1960s and into the 1970s, in programs whose direct conceptual lineage ran back to the strategic vulnerabilities the crisis had exposed. The Soviet defense establishment made corresponding investments on its side of the ledger. The lesson Moscow drew from the crisis was that nuclear parity with the United States was the minimum condition for Soviet security, and the defense spending that followed reflected that conclusion. Soviet military expenditure as a share of national income increased in the decade after the crisis, contributing to the economic pressures that the Soviet system would struggle to sustain over the following 30 years. The financial consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis, traced to their full extent across both military establishments and across the decades that followed, represent a magnitude of resource allocation that the standard account of 13 days never attempts to measure, and that the populations of both countries were never asked to authorize as the cost of the resolution. The admission that most directly illuminates the gap between the official account and the financial record came from Robert McNamara. Kennedy's Secretary of Defense participated in a retrospective conference held in Havana in January of 1992, 30 years after the crisis, that brought together American, Soviet, and Cuban officials who had been directly involved in the events of October 1962. McNamara acknowledged in that conference that the American government had been actively planning military operations against Cuba that the Cuban and Soviet governments would have had every rational reason to anticipate. He stated, in terms that were recorded and subsequently published, that from the Cuban and Soviet perspective, the deployment of nuclear missiles to Cuba was a reasonable defensive response to credible American military planning. That acknowledgement, made by the man who had run the American defense establishment during the crisis itself, was published in the academic literature on the missile crisis, covered in serious historical writing, and largely absent from the popular narrative that continued to reach the general public through textbooks, documentaries, and the commemorative coverage that surrounds every significant anniversary of the events. The official account of 13 days of courage and restraint remained the version that persisted, because that version is more coherent as a story of leadership, more flattering to the political reputations of the men who made the decisions, and less demanding of an accounting that would require the public to engage with the $1 billion in displaced corporate capital, the multi-year covert military investment, the secret agreement that removed the Turkish missiles from the settlement's public ledger, and the embargo mechanism whose financial logic was built on corporate interests that no longer existed in recoverable form. The financial record was always available in the sources. The sources simply were not the version of history that most people inherited. What the ledger shows, placed beside the standard account of the Cuban Missile Crisis, is a crisis that was not a confrontation that emerged from Soviet expansionism or communist ideology seeking a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. What it shows is a crisis that was the terminal expression of a decade-long financial and military investment in the removal of a government that had displaced American corporate capital on a scale the American government was structurally incapable of treating as commercially neutral. The Soviet missiles were the price of that investment, the military cost that the American investment in Cuban destabilization eventually generated. The Cuban embargo was the financial instrument that survived the crisis and continued operating as policy long after the strategic and commercial conditions that produced it had changed beyond any recognition. The populations on both sides of the Florida Strait were told the story that fit the political requirements of the governments that shaped it. Neither population was given the full account of the $1 billion in displaced corporate assets, the $100 million in covert military spending, the secret agreement that removed the Turkish missiles from the settlement's public ledger, or the embargo mechanism whose institutional life has far exceeded the financial interests that helped create it. That account does not appear in the standard version because the standard version was not designed to contain it. The financial architecture of the Cuban Missile Crisis was constructed before the missiles arrived and continued operating long after they left. The crisis lasted 13 days. The mechanism it was built upon has lasted more than 60 years. That mechanism, and not the 13 days, is where the record of what actually happened lives. And the populations governed by that mechanism were never given the accounting. The balance sheet of October 1962 was settled between governments and corporations and military establishments in rooms that produced no public minutes and left no accessible ledger. What reached the public was the story of 2 men, 2 arsenals, and 13 days. What the record shows is something considerably larger, more durable, and still very much in operation. The corporate interests that set the machinery in motion were absorbed into reorganized balance sheets. The government programs that executed the strategy were reclassified or quietly discontinued. The embargo became a standing instrument of foreign policy, administered by successive administrations that inherited it as precedent rather than adopted it as choice. The historical narrative that framed the crisis as a story of leadership under pressure became the version taught in schools, produced in documentary form, and cited in the commemorative coverage that surrounds each anniversary. The financial record that shows what preceded the missiles, what the missiles actually cost across both military establishments, and what the settlement's private terms concealed, remained in specialist archives, academic monographs, and the partially declassified files of committees that completed their work decades ago. That record has always been available, The version most people carry is simply not the one that contains it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.